before we begin, congratulations to both teams for making it this far. It's been a really great tournament. Thank you to all the judges for making this debate possible, coming out here and judging for us on Sunday. And also to my partner for supporting me. Alrighty, is everyone ready? All judges ready? Okay, let's begin. As the resolution states, the United States federal government should substantially increase investment into space-based military technology. Now let's go over a couple of observations before we get into the affirmations case today. First observation is going to be of a couple of definitions. When we talk about space-based objects, we're going to be looking towards things like satellites and missile defense systems, things that are essentially, based in space. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Second observation is going to be that this is a policy round, as the word should in the resolution implies a call to action upon our government, and therefore we will be debating a policy presented to you by the affirmation side, in which you, the judges, will evaluate this round on net benefits. Whichever team can prove to you the most societal welfare for the most amount of people will be winning this round. The third observation is that of some background. So first of all, we see that China and Russia are already working on this type of military, this space-based military technology. We've seen their numbers of activity increase in the past couple of months. Second of all, you can see that only $8.9 billion right now out of around $300 billion is actually being put into this type of space technology, which means we have a lot of opportunity and a lot of more money that we could be investing, which brings us to our plan. First, the mandate is USFG will invest $20 billion into the development of reconnaissance satellites. Again, USFG will invest $20 billion into the development of reconnaissance satellites. I will go over to what that technology is in the solvency, but just know that that plan is going to happen as soon as possible and through normal ways and means. Now, let's explain what these reconnaissance satellites essentially are. So under the solvency, first of all, these are essentially very big developed satellites that take pictures of footage and can send the footage into capsules in which that information is therefore taken in when it drops onto Earth. You can see that they're actually responsible for reporting national disasters and humanitarian crisis, as the camera on these satellites can detect areas of human heat and can see from a very far away area the resolution as to what is happening. Third of all, they can detect body heat, which means that they can even zoom into a specific individual building and see what is happening there and detect specific hostages that are within the situation. I'll get to you right after the solvency. And fourth of all, these are usually going to be regularly funded through the budget that the United States allocates for military space technology. Question?
So how exactly is this different from a normal picture-taking satellite?
These are normal from normal picture-taking satellites because the normal satellites we use right now don't have this high resolution. So this has caused a lot of problems, which I will get into our first advantage, which is about humanitarian aid. So uniqueness, or what is happening right now, is that first of all, there have been current satellites have been able to detect human crises, but not been able to solve them completely. For example, in Pakistan, around 3,000 people were able to be detected in a hostage situation due to the drones that had similar resolution to the technology that we are going to be implementing. But there was no enforcement mechanism for us to actually go in and verify that information. So that's what our plan would be changing. A second example is that a typhoon struck in the Philippines in 2013, and there were only satellites without this high resolution that could have detected these people, and this actually resulted in 2,000 people not being detected because these satellites did not have that high resolution, and so this resulted in 2,000 people not being reached in that specific area. You can also see after this case, you can also see that the same example with an earthquake in Nepal that happened in 2015, where the satellites that we have right now were not able to correctly identify the amount of people that needed our help, and that hindered our ability to send aid and get those people out. So, and we also have a statement from the former defense secretary that said that the best way to detect these kinds of situations would be with this reconnaissance satellite. So we've already seen that this satellite is the best available option for us. We haven't invested the money into it. So what happens when we pass our plan is that first of all, we invest this type of money to increase the amount of reconnaissance satellites with this better resolution and with the focus that can zoom in on these situations to accurately depict what is happening. That means, second of all, we can send humanitarian aid to places in the Middle East, to places in Southeast Asia that are suffering from these natural disasters or these humanitarian crises. Also, we are able to solve back for hostage situations, which our military is supposed to be protecting civilians there, and therefore our military is able to be more effective in saving these people. We can look towards specifically on the impact, therefore, of saving lives, and that we are able to get people out of situations and also protect hostages from being killed because we can accurately depict the situation. I'm sorry, I will get to your question if I have time at the end. So the second advantage will be about scientific diplomacy. So let's set out the scenario for what's happening right now. Right now, China and Russia are escalating. You can see that China is planning to permanently establish and staff their own space station, and they've projected to have completed this by March 2018. Also, in Russia, the 2016 report, their defense officers have acknowledged that they are going to be deploying new laser weapons that could blind United States intelligence away from us, meaning they're going to be establishing a ballistic missile defense satellite and be able to block our ability to gain intelligence. So if the United States is not developing technology to counter that, that means that China and Russia are going to be out-competing. That means that we cannot accurately look at situations or conflicts in the Middle East or Southeast Asia, and we will not be able, our military will be hindered in efforts to go in there and figure out what's going on. I told you I would get to the end if I have time. So the link level, first of all, when the plan passes, is that the United States is going to be investing money to development, and we can send more of these satellites into space. That means that perceptually, China and Russia will see this as scientific advancement for better intelligence, and they will not try to intercept our ways. That means in terms of innovation, you can see that the specific example that the space race in the 1960s allowed for technology like the domestic vacuum that we all use today, and also communication satellites. You can see that new innovation is being developed all the time. Also, you can see that countries are going to be competing, and this will spill over into different types of competing. For example, green tech energy is very correlated with science, with scientists and people who work in space. So that means that we can also be combating things like climate change, because we can also be combating things like climate change when this spills over into those industries. That means that when these countries are working together, negotiating together under the force of science innovation, it means that we are able to save the environment and able to save these types of lives and maintain this kind of cooperation. For those reasons, vote out.
So the order will be just like an observation, 2 disadvantages, and then the case.
Question, where should this observation be floated?
You just float above the first decide. Okay, everybody ready? One conception that the affirmative seems to have during this round is that somehow us sending a super camera to space is going to be embraced by all of these countries. I don't think that's going to be particularly the case. They seem to think that if we send a super camera to space, every country will only think, oh, this is for scientific purposes. That's going to be problematic, because if we send a super camera to space to take a bunch of photos of whatever we want, I think logically it would be seen that this would be very useful for military purposes, and other countries would rebel. I'll get on to why that's problematic later, but our first disadvantage is going to be space debris. Now, look at what's happening right now. Space debris is currently increasing, and this has been building up for a long time. NASA estimates that there are about 7 million pieces of space debris that are already floating around our planet. Now, space debris occurs when we launch things up, and then the rockets that take them up there stay there. Now, we are currently at the current rate that we're building up space debris. We're at a pretty much carrying capacity where we cannot have any more space debris before it becomes very dangerous. NASA calls this the Kepler effect, because if we have too much large space debris, that ultimately means that the space debris keeps on colliding and builds more space debris. Now, why is the space debris bad? Why should we try preventing the space debris? Now, this is especially bad because these pieces of debris fly at around 17,000 miles per hour around space, and they also can collide into many things. And for example, we've seen where space shuttles have had to be repaired because they got hit by a fleck of paint from an earlier rocket on the window. So we can see this, the space debris is very dangerous. And we can see that it's going to be especially problematic if we're sending a bunch and we're sending and testing a bunch of these new satellites to go into space. I think this is very logical. If you're trying to send these up, you have to have multiple rockets, multiple tests. You have to send a lot of stuff into space and build a lot of debris there. Currently, this debris is not there. We're going to be adding that debris. Now, why is that bad? Now, obviously, by increasing this amount of space debris and going over the Kepler cut by so much, that's going to be bad because it ultimately means that space debris is going to start colliding with a lot of the current satellites that we have, which are key to the information that they seem to want to get, which ultimately means that if we're destroying the satellites and we're destroying information, that's obviously going to mean that's the reason to vote against them because they want to gather information. They're destroying the information by creating a bunch of space debris out there. In addition, it also makes repairs much more difficult because the space debris makes it so difficult for the astronauts to actually go up there and actually fix these things. And again, they talk about how information is so good, so important. We obviously don't want to be adding to the space debris. Our argument would be that the information for all this climate change research and all this stuff, the GPS and shipping routes, these things that are benefit or that satellites give us right now, this is all very good stuff. And we don't need actually any more. We'll get on to why that's true later. But what we have is good right now for all the things we need. Let's not destroy that by adding a bunch of space debris by launching all these satellites. The second disadvantage is of proliferation, and specifically with our relations. Now, there are two specific scenarios that we want to go over here. One is with China and one is with Russia. Now, obviously, you might have heard that we are on maybe mild footing with both these countries right now. However, our space cooperation with Russia right now is still extremely strong. We can see that there is despite the sanctions that we put on Russia recently, we carved out exceptions for the space industry, which is an indication as to how space cooperation is high with Russia and the US right now. However, what happens when we actually send these super cameras? Now, remember what I said at the very beginning of my speech. Just because we say we're sending it up for scientific and humanitarian aid, that does not mean Russia is going to view this as just scientific and humanitarian aid. This is especially problematic because now they're saying, oh, look, the US can take very detailed thermal images and take very detailed photos of all our troop movements of our entire country, things that they weren't able to do before. That's especially problematic. Imagine if someone started taking very detailed pictures of all the US troop movements. Obviously, the US would get very angry. Now, how is Russia going to backlash? Now, we believe that if Russia is now very angry at us for launching all these satellites, they would actually cut off our access to the Kazakhstan launch station, which is critical. The Kazakhstan launch station, which is controlled by Russia, is the only way for the US to actually send humans into space right now. Because we do not have a space shuttle program anymore, we rely on Russia's cooperation to actually launch any person into space, which means that if we anger Russia, we ultimately will get cut off from the Kazakhstan launch station. What does this mean? This means that we no longer get access to any of the benefits that we currently have by putting humans in space. And I think that's very problematic because we have a lot of people that are conducting research at the International Space Station. A lot more research is being done by these humans in space right now than we could ever gather with sending any sort of super cameras into space. If we lose access to this Kazakhstan launch site, which is very likely if Russia thinks that we are now trying to launch a bunch of cameras to take pictures of them in space, that's going to be bad. The other scenario is China. China obviously is very interested in protecting their power in space. They have the anti-satellite missile, they have a lot of these things. Now, what's going to happen if we start doing the same thing? Remember, we can say we're doing it for scientific reasons and humanitarian reasons, but remember, China and Russia are not going to see it that way. They're going to think we're going to try to spy on them. So they will probably equally escalate. Now, China's probably going to escalate in the South China Sea, and that would obviously be really bad, because an escalation in tensions in the South China Sea would ultimately mean that a probability of an escalation of war in the regional actors area. So they could start pretty much attacking the local countries around the South China Sea area. Obviously, you don't want any of that happening, and I think those impacts are going to outweigh heavily. And remember, they want science diplomacy. I don't think the Russians cutting off our access to Kazakhstan and not being able to send humans into space anymore, I think that's very undiplomatic for science. Let's go into their case. Just an overall observation on the case. Their first two advantages contradict each other completely. In the first advantage, they say these satellites can now take pictures and help us with everything. Then in their second advantage, they tell us China and Russia China is developing technology that makes our satellites useless. Think about it this way. If they're saying that China is developing technology that makes our satellites useless right now, then I don't think their plan actually does anything in the first place. Because even if we launch these awesome cameras into space, because China's already developing technology to make these satellites functionally useless, their plan does absolutely nothing. We send it up, they have the technology to destroy these things, make it able to see nothing. They don't solve for anything now. But let's go into specifically. Now, in the first advantage, a critical mistake they made is they say that we already have this type of technology on drones. Wouldn't it be nice if we had this on satellites? We were able to save a bunch of people because we had this technology on drones. I see no reason why we can't just use more drones with this technology to be able to solve for all these climate disasters and these hostage situations. There's absolutely no reason why we need to have satellites uniquely. In addition, I would make the argument that the only reason that these hostages were even found in the first place was because they were using drones to actively search for them, not a random satellite circling the planet, not knowing where to look to find things. So I think that ultimately this is a very non-unique and advantage with no teeth, or with no impacts. In addition, they say that it's key humanitarian aid. I don't think that's going to happen either, because they tell you themselves, it drops an information capsule to Earth. That takes way too long for any humanitarian aid to get through. On their second advantage, remember, it doesn't matter what perception or what we say we are. If we're sending a super camera to space, China and Russia are going to hate us, and that ultimately leads to an increase in the space race, which is very bad for militarization. It's also going to make it so that there's zero science diplomacy. Remember, they're going to cut off our access to space and science. That is obviously bad.
As a quick off-time roadmap, I'm going to be going over the affirmative case first and then the negative case. Once again, thank you to everyone for making this debate possible. Congratulations on making this far. Is everyone ready? Everyone good?
Yeah.
Starting right off with our first advantage about humanitarian aid, their first response here is that we can simply use more drones. However, they completely misconceptualize what my partner is trying to tell you. My partner is saying we have high-resolution images from drones, but those aren't enough. That's why she's saying that thousands of people were actually stuck and weren't able to be detected by these very drones because they didn't have the access that we can gain through our satellites. This means that since drones, number one, cannot go as high up and get as wide of a radius, this means we're actually leaving a lot of people trapped in places without even realizing they're there in the first place. So no, drones are not working in the status quo. Simply adding more drones is not going to provide any more solvency to the issue of humanitarian aid. The next response here is that the information capsule takes too long to drop to Earth. However, this is not how it works. We're not physically dropping this ball of information onto the ground. We're sending it via the internet, via the connectivity of devices from the satellite to the United States, computers and stuff like that. So it happens instantaneously. It's not a physical drop from outer space to Earth, which means that pretty much they have no response against this that is offensive, which means all of our impacts about how we are actually able to save thousands of lives from people when they're stuck in a hostage situation, or if they're stuck in a mountain range that no one can see because of a natural disaster, we are able to prevent these people from dying. This is a huge impact that should be counted towards our side in this round. Our second advantage is about scientific diplomacy. First, the response here is that they say China makes our satellites useless, which means our plan does nothing. No, once again, we say that this is happening in the status quo. They're making our current satellites useless because our current satellites don't have the technology nor the flight range in order to escape these Chinese lasers. This is why we need the reconnaissance satellites to be built and created and sent up in the first place. Yes, we know that China is making our satellites useless. That's why we need the plan. So thank you for making our point for us. The only satellites that will be damaged by China are the old ones. Next, they talk about how there's zero scientific diplomacy because they cut us off on our bases. I'll take it at the end if I have time. However, this is not going to happen for several reasons. The first reason is that right now within the status quo, when Trump has talked about how science is not very important to his agenda, Russia and China are seeing this as a power vacuum, so they're actually escalating further right now in the status quo than they would if the U.S. was also a major presence within the space race, which means they're actually much more likely to cut off our bases now because they see us as weak. China and Russia will only admire another nation or respect another nation's property if they see that that nation is capable of competing on the same level. If we become weaker and weaker because our satellites are being blinded by China and Russia, we won't have access to those bases at any point in the future if we continue with the status quo. This means that since they don't have any more responses on this advantage, you can look towards our impacts and how we're actually going to be spurring innovation and how healthy competition, like during the 1960s space race, actually created technology for solar panels that we use today, which means we have access to solving issues that are affecting people worldwide, like global warming. Let's move on to their disadvantages. Their first disadvantage is about space debris. So the first argument they make is that it's currently increasing, but we're at carrying capacity. Now here's a clear contradiction. If we're currently increasing and will increase at the status quo, and if we're already at the carrying capacity, then what is stopping the status quo from going over that carrying capacity literally tomorrow? This makes absolutely no sense. Additionally, the status quo cannot solve because NASA is still continuously sending rockets up into space. SpaceX is continually shooting up rockets and landing them and just exploding them in the middle of the desert, which means that this plan alone is not going to trigger trigger the impacts of this disadvantage, so you shouldn't be voting against our plan because of this space debris case. Additionally, when you talk about how our satellites are going to cause debris, our argument is that the plan is actually more able to solve than sticking with the status quo. Because right now, in the status quo, if what you say is true, and if we are at carrying capacity, this means there's no spotlight or no focus on the issue of space debris. But if we're sending up, if the United States is putting $20 billion into sending these new tech satellites into outer space, this means that they will also have to come up with ways to limit the amount of space debris. And they've already started developing different types of technology to limit the amount of space debris that can affect the other satellites in the atmosphere, or past the atmosphere. For example, we can use a solar sail that allows satellites and other spaceborne objects to return in space with the little pieces burned up in our atmosphere, which means they're not actually going to be colliding with other space objects, which means we don't actually cause any of the negative impacts of like space objects hitting each other and destroying information in space. Another alternative is deorbiting broken satellites as a pair. This type of technology and programming within the satellites is also already being developed under the plan for reconnaissance satellites. So our argument is that sticking with the status quo is only going to make the issue of space debris worse, whereas if we pass our plan and if we spur innovation and investment into the issue of making sure our satellites return to Earth safely, we're better able to reduce the probability that our information will be messed up past the atmosphere. Their second disadvantage is about Russia and China. First, they talked about Russia. Right now, they say that space cooperation with Russia is still strong. However, this is clearly not true. Look towards what my partner said in the background about how Russia is using our lack of presence in space military to actually increase their space program right now within the status quo. So if you're arguing that the Russian militarizing is really bad, then it is happening in your world as well. Additionally, when you talk about how Russia thinks the U.S. is taking pictures of its troop movements, our argument is that this is also happening in the status quo. The U.S. can use its normal satellites to track troop movements already because of the fact that it doesn't take a very high-resolution satellite to see a bunch of troops. What we specifically isolate as key are the reconnaissance satellites' ability to see hard-to-find people trapped in small regions that are able to be seen by normal satellites, which means if Russia's going to take away our base because we can see their troops, they would have done so already because we can already see their troops. Next, I'll take it at the end of our time. They talk about the Kazakhstan launch station. Our argument is, again, investment solved. If we are able to spur interest and investment within the scientific industry within the United States, we could be able to create our own bases so we won't have to rely on Russia anymore. Additionally, our argument is, again, they're on the path to doing this in the status quo. They're already planning to block our intelligence with lasers, which means that they are already on the track to cutting away our access, which means that we are not able, our plan is not going to cause the negative impacts of Russia. Sticking to the status quo will be worse. Then the next disadvantage is about China. Right now they talk about how China will escalate in the South China Sea because of our plan. Our argument is, again, this is not going to happen because right now they're already escalating in the South China Sea when the U.S. is weak, so sticking with the status quo is probably worse. Additionally, you can look towards our analysis that shows that China is actually interested in the technology we're using in these reconnaissance satellites, which means they're actually more likely to cooperate with us when we pass the plan and more likely to become peaceful in the South China Sea. So for all these reasons, I urge a strong affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Over a couple of observations, and then onto the whole our disadvantage about proliferation, and then the whole space blue debate with their humanitarianism and insights of the civilians. Alright. Is everybody ready? Yes. Alright. I'll start. Recognize the fact that a lot of our disadvantages mean that ultimately a lot of the advantages will never materialize. Remember, if we are not able to cooperate with Russia on the space issues, if we are not able to cooperate with China on space issues, then that means a lot of issues in terms of cooperating with humanitarian aid is something that is simply unable to materialize and would mean that the disadvantages would always come first. Let's look at the specific reasons of why our disadvantage here is going to win us today's round, and let's talk about proliferation in specific. Now, the only response that they have made here is that Russia is increasing its space program in the status quo. Well, yes, but that doesn't tell us anything. Specifically, what we see right now is that U.S. and Russia relations specifically are good, and this is that despite the fact that Russia has been militarizing the space or has been having a program in this space, does not reflect anything in terms of Russian and U.S. relations. That means that even if Russia has a bunch of weapons in space, that ultimately doesn't matter because right now Russia and the United States specifically have good relations that would disincentivize Russia from using these weapons. The problem comes in that when the United States gives Russia a reason to use these weapons, that is what actually caused all of their problems about militarization. We would say that militarization on its own is not a problem, but only in the context of when relations are bad. Now, we also have a lot of good analysis on why our relations are specifically good in space right now. For example, we see that right now our space industry are heavily dependent on each other. For example, we get a lot of space technology and do a lot of trading between industries between the United States and Russia because we are so because of our close relations with Russia and the United States. But moreover, you can also look into our example of how Russia currently lets us use their space station in Kazakhstan to allow us launch our ships and whatever into space. Now, these are all very good reasons to believe why our relations are currently strong right now and do not risk any of these escalation. And how, even if we look towards China right now, we're very clearly not going to war with China. In fact, if we look towards anything, we've actually recently signed a 4-track dialogue mechanism with China, as well as a recent grain deal with China, which would indicate how our relations are currently very good right now. The problem is when you give a reason for China to think that, oh, maybe the United States shouldn't be trusted, that's when all these problems happen. Now, all of their arguments about power vacuum and how Russia and China would try to take over simply doesn't make sense in this context because there's really no issue even if they take over because they're still benefiting the United States due to our good relations. However, the fact that Russia and China are trying to basically have a presence in the space would only become a problem in the context of if we have bad relations. Now, furthermore, I think that they've also given you no reason as to believe why China and Russia would not like these space cameras in specific. Now, they say that normal satellites can detect troop movements and how this is a problem, but then they tell you that these super satellites can basically do things like detecting what would like to be hidden in very small regions. Now, I imagine that a lot of Russian and Chinese probably would have operations that they would like to keep hidden from the United States that they would try to put in small regions. And these are the very things that Russia and China would be very fearful of getting discovered if the United States starts putting up these really high-resolution cameras into space. That's really problematic for them because that means that there is a very good reason to believe as to why Russia and China will be uniquely fearful of these space cameras in particular and not be scared of our these normal cameras because obviously like normal troop movements again are not something that is not something that is like very critical. Like they announce training drills all the time, right? That's something that's very out in the open. But there are some things that are meant to be hidden that Russia and China would not uniquely want the United States to be spying them on. So now this is also going to be really critical in terms of the fact that there's a huge impact here of a potential conflict with Russia and China, both potentially within space, but also directly in the fact that we can see that there could be escalation in the South China Sea. Now they say that escalation is happening right now. I think it's very clear that, again, we are very clearly not going to war with China, but that this could only become a potential if we give China the reason to believe that the United States is interested in maybe spying on China, detecting very critical national security issues. Now, they also talk about how China is interested in our technology and would try to be friends with us so that we would share that information with them. Now, I think that if you look at what China thinks, that if they think that this information is being used against them, they would probably not think that the United States would give them this information because they think that the technology is being used to spy on them. That means that the calculus that is going on in China's head is that they would think that there's no reason why the United States would give that technology to China because they think that it's being used against China. That would mean that there's no reason why China would ever try to cooperate with the United States once this technology goes into deployment because it is such a concern in critical national security issues. Let's go into our second disadvantage, which is that of space debris. Now, they talk about how this is actually going to be good because it spotlights how space debris is a problem. And then they tell you about how we already have lots of plans going on to prevent space debris from being a problem. I think that very clearly shows you that we don't need more spotlight and that this is an issue. But however, another issue here is simply the fact that right now there are these solutions, but the problem is that what NASA specifically says is that space debris is such a big issue and that the only way you can solve for it is with some sort of a very big fix. The problem that NASA also tells you is that this big fix simply doesn't exist, which is why we have to try to limit the space debris as much as possible, because the only way to resolve the problem completely is to get rid of all the space debris. But on the other hand, this technology is simply infeasible, which is why there is a very crucial interest in terms of preventing all of these debris from happening in the first place. Let's go into their advantage about humanitarianism. Now, first I would like to observe that we would say that the potential and conflict for war against China and Russia is going to be crucial and going to be outweighing this advantage in a couple of ways. The first being that we would say that the lives lost in such a conflict between Russia and China would be far That would prevent any of our humanitarian capabilities in the first place. For example, we would not be able to cooperate with them on disaster relief, but more importantly that there's a high possibility that Russia and China would just, again, block our satellites. Now they say that these new satellites can't be blocked because they are, just can't be because they're new satellites. Again, that's not how satellites work, because these satellites would still be flying at the same range. China and Russia could still target them. The only difference is that they are taking pictures at a different resolution. That doesn't mean that China and Russia can't attack these very same satellites and also block them, which means that not only would China and Russia block our current satellites, but they would also block these new satellites get developed, which means that this would actually be really bad in terms of our humanitarian response. Next, we tell you that this would take too long to solve the problem. They say that they can send it through the internet. The problem is it also takes a very long time to actually get information and send the necessary aid to places like the Middle East, which means that even if you don't take into account the fact that there are issues in terms of getting the information down, there are also issues in terms of actually getting the aid there, which is why we need the cooperation of other countries. Finally, on scientific diplomacy, I think I've answered this sufficiently that there's really no reason why people would think that this is a move towards diplomacy. That's communicate.
Everybody ready? Everything comes down to perception and whether this new camera is actually going to be really important to China or Russia. Problem for them is they articulate it very clearly for us. These old cameras couldn't see a lot of things. They couldn't see them at a very high resolution. These new cameras can see pretty much everything. Imagine this. If there was someone outside your house with a normal camera and then that same person had a thermal or X-ray camera, I think you'd be a lot more scared of your privacy if they could see everything inside your house as well that wasn't blocked by walls. That's the same logic. We have cameras right now that can't see a lot of things that China and Russia want to stay hidden. However, we're sending this super camera up into space now. It doesn't matter what they tell you and what the US tells them. They will be fearful of this because the things that they wanted to stay hidden, the things they want to keep underground away from normal satellites, the things that they want to keep in the side of mountains, and the things that they don't want to be seen right now, these will all be seen by these new cameras. I think if you are China and Russia, you do not want this happening. Why? I think it's also very obvious. You want to keep these things hidden, which means that the probability of the disadvantage of China and Russia lashing out and getting very angry at us is extremely high. Now, why is this important? This is important because they will backlash immediately. This means that all the impacts about how they will cut off our access to science and space, and they will cut off our access and possibly escalate to conflict, these all come before any of their advantages. They talk about how they want humanitarian aid, how they want to have science diplomacy. These things cannot happen if the two biggest countries in space right now are furious at us because they think that we are spying on them. So which means that you need to evaluate this one. Now, let's go into this advantage specifically. Remember, a critical mistake that they make is that they are sending awesome cameras into space. Now, sure, these cameras are awesome, but they can see almost everything. Again, my partner and I have been very clear on this. There are things that they want to stay hidden. If now the US can see every single thing that they are doing that cannot be seen by regular satellites because maybe they're underground, then I think very obviously they would get angry at us. And the specific scenario that's going to be very important to us right now, or that's going to be very important in this one, is the fact that they will cut off our human access to space. Remember how it was a huge bit of news a few years ago when the U.S. space human program or the space shuttle program ended? The human space shuttle program ended, and as a result, we have no ways of sending people into space anymore from the U.S. That is why all of the people you see that are from the U.S. that are getting sent up to the International Space Station are now launching out of Russian shuttles out of Kazakhstan, which is the station controlled by Russia. Why are they, and now if Russia gets furious at us now because they think we are spying on them in space, obviously they would cut off our access to space so that we can't actually fix these satellites when they try shooting them down, fix these satellites when they were actually going into trouble. Which means that our access to the International Space Station from Kazakhstan, which is the only way we can get up to space because we cannot rebuild our space shuttle program completely, that would cost hundreds of billions of dollars, that goes away. That means that science diplomacy goes to zero. They are angry at us and we have no people in the International Space Station anymore. All the research that's being done up there gets cut off from us and we get no access to any of the technology that they are talking about. They say it'd be great to solve global warming with these satellites and with these new things. They say it'd be great to develop new technology in the zero-gravity environment of space. None of this happens because we are not able to send our scientists into space anymore, which means ultimately this comes first before all their other things. I think that's going to be very important. Now, Also, there's another possibility of the escalation with China. Again, China already has a lot of interest in keeping us out of like spying on them, out of like our presence away from space. If we launch this super like awesome camera into space, then obviously they would retaliate and escalate within the South China Sea region, which I think, as all of you know, is already a hotspot for conflict. Which means the probability of the war with China within this area and like is the same probability as us saving some people in the humanitarian disaster, but the magnitude of a war is so much greater. Now, again, this disadvantage comes first. Let's talk about their contradiction on the first and second disadvantages. They make a critical mistake when they are writing this, and they are now trying to backtrack out of it in their first speech, or in their second speech. However, I do not think they understand how satellites work and how satellites are going to get affected by this. They talk about how these satellites are great because they fly at a greater orbit that is outside the range of these new Chinese weapons. That really sucks for them because that is simply false. Because satellites fly at the same range around the Earth. There is a satellite orbit, there is an International Space Station orbit, and then there's space debris where you cannot fly satellites in other places. The satellite orbit means that all satellites fly at this orbit. That ultimately means that they cannot launch a satellite that is further from there because that satellite is not within the satellite orbit where you're able to actually circulate the Earth. What does that mean? That means that you're not able to get out of this disadvantage, which means you do not go on humanitarian aid. Again, I think the probability of us saving some 200 people from humanitarian aid is greatly outweighed by the fact that now we cannot save hundreds of thousands of lives from scientific discoveries that we're getting cut off from, or the probability of war.
Everyone ready? Okay, let's wrap up this debate. 3, 2, 1. The number one reason you are going to be voting for the affirmation today is because the negation team does not understand that escalation from countries like Russia and China are inevitable and already happening in the status quo. That means that when our plan passes, there is no unique reason for why we are going to be escalating their actions. Let's go into the specific warrantation, the reasons why you are going to be leaving us over them. First of all, they can see the response that my partner says where we tell you that Russia and China are currently escalating because they see Trump as weak. He is not putting money into science. He is not putting money into all of these developments. That means they are currently taking advantage of the fact that the United States is not a really big actor in the scientific community. You can see in the example where we brought up of Russia, they were the ones that are coming up with laser technology, planning to use them to block United States intelligence. That is a warrant that they have conceded throughout this entire debate. They tried to bring you reasons for why Russia and China have already been working together, but these warrants were under President Obama. These were warrants in which the United States was at an equal level with Russia. That means that we have the most up-to-date information for why Russia now, because they see us as weak, is developing new technology against us. The third reason you're going to be voting for us is the situation with China. China right now is escalating in the South China Sea independent of what the United States is doing. That means that when the plan passes, there is no reason for them to just escalate further because they're already doing that right now. That means the plan would not anger them any further than they're already angered. That means the entirety of the negations case has a very, very low probability of triggering any war impacts. Whereas for the outer,
this argument that China would escalate in the South China Sea and go to war with the United States in the status quo is definitely a new argument. We've been telling you that you have to give, China will only escalate if they are given a reason to. I think that this is a new response.
My partner specifically says that China is, it's already a non-unique, China is already escalating in the status quo. They already have advances in the South China Sea right now, and they're taking advantage of the fact that the United States is weak. I think that's a pretty argument that we've been debating with this entire round. Yeah, I'm not going for the fact that war is inevitable. Okay. Ready? Okay. I'm trying to argue that there's a very low probability of war should our plan pass. Whereas but let's go specifically to the negations case. First of all, they're trying to say that like Russia and China are also going to be like they're going to escalate if they see us all of a sudden putting this high resolution satellite into the air. This is not going to happen because we tell you, and this is a very important argument that they drop that my partner makes, is that China is actually interested in the same technology that the US is doing. It's just a matter of fact that they don't have the money or the intelligence to do so. That means they are not going to be seeing the United States as spying on them. They're going to want to get in with this type of technology and more likely to cooperate with the United States. They're saying that Russia and China are going to be afraid of high resolution, but this is what's happening right now. We already have existent satellites that can track troop movements. Russia and China are already aware of the existing satellites. The only thing that the negation cannot solve for is the fact that these satellites right now cannot detect hostage situations. They can't detect natural disasters that are preventing 2,000 people from being relieved in these areas. But let's go specifically to the negations case, things that the affirmation cannot solve for. First, about humanitarian aid. They say that we are a point about humanitarian aid. They say that we don't need to cooperate with Russia and China because they will escalate, and something about how our resolution is going to be transversing into all of these countries, and they're going to feel violated. First of all, we tell you that there's a 100% probability of natural disaster. We have arguments that say that there's a reason that China and Russia want to cooperate. It's because they want to compete with our technology. There won't be lives lost because of this conflict. But second of all, science diplomacy actually expands human aid access. Look towards how the space race, again in the 1960s, it empirically proves how we increase our communications between satellites. Meaning we have empirics on our side that prove to you why these nations would be cooperating with each other, whereas the negation side cannot prove to you. Also, we tell you that our technology can fly much higher than the drones that they are arguing for. That means that That means that Russia and China cannot block the intelligence from this technology because it's so much higher than the existing drones they're using right now. That means that we are outweighing on the probability that the negation cannot solve for the fact that currently there are 2,000 people that are not being reached because the current satellites aren't working. And second of all, hostage situations result in hostage situations are not being detected right now. That means there is a unique reason to be voting for the affirmation because these are problems that will persist in the status quo if you vote for the negation side. There is nothing, and they have made no arguments to prove why the status quo can solve for these issues. That means that there is no technology in the status quo by Russia or China that's able to solve for these problems. And the United States is the only one with this type of technology, and the only way that we can save these lives, which is going to be outweighing the probability of war, is to be voting for the affirmation team.